The Fürstenenteignung was the proposed expropriation of the dynastic properties of the former ruling houses of the German Empire during the period of the Weimar Republic. These princes had been deposed in the German Revolution of 1918–19. Dispute over the proposed expropriation began in the months of revolution and continued in the following years in the form of negotiations or litigation between individual royal houses and the states of the German Reich. The climactic points of the conflict was a successful petition for a referendum in the first half of 1926, followed by the actual referendum for expropriation without compensation, which failed. The petition was initiated by the German Communist Party, who were then joined, with some reluctance, by the Social Democrats. It was not only the KPD and SPD voters who supported expropriation without compensation. Many supporters of the Centre Party and the German Democratic Party were also in favor. In some regions, voters of conservative national parties also supported expropriation. Associations of the aristocracy, the churches of the two major denominations, large-scale farming and industrial interest groups, as well as right-wing parties and associations supported the dynastic houses. Their calls for a boycott finally brought about the failure of the referendum. Expropriation without compensation was replaced by individual compensation agreements, which regulated the distribution of the estates among the states and the former ruling families. Politicians and historians have differing interpretations of the events. While the official East German version of history stressed the actions of the Communist Party of the time, West German historians pointed to the substantial burdens that the referendum initiatives put on the cooperation between the SPD and the Republican parties of the bourgeoisie. Attention is also drawn to the generational conflicts that emerged in this political dispute. The campaign for expropriation without compensation is also sometimes seen as a positive example of direct democracy. Developments up to the end of 1925. The November Revolution ended the reign of the ruling dynasties in Germany. These found themselves in a position of having to abdicate power and, given the new overall political situation, did this voluntarily or were deposed. The property was seized, but they were not immediately dispossessed. In contrast to the situation in Austria, there were no seizures of assets at the national level because there was no corresponding property. The national authorities did not implement a nationwide policy but left it up to the individual states. In addition, the Council of the People's Deputies was concerned that any such seizures of property might encourage the victors to lay claim to the confiscated estates for reparations. Article 153 of the Weimar Constitution of 1919 guaranteed property, but the article also provided for the possibility of seizure of assets in the public interest. Such a seizure of assets was permitted only on the basis of a law, and the dispossessed were entitled to reasonable compensation. The article provided for recourse to the courts in case of disputes. The negotiations between the governments of each state and the royal houses were protracted because of the differing views on the level of compensation. The negotiating parties often struggled with the question of what the former rulers were entitled to as private property, as opposed to those possessions which they held only in their capacity as sovereign. On the basis of Article 153 of the Constitution, some royal houses demanded the return of all the former property and compensation for lost income. The situation was complicated by the decreasing value of money as a result of inflation, which reduced the value of compensation payments. For this reason, some of the royal families subsequently contested agreements that they had previously concluded with the states. The properties concerned were of considerable significance to the economy. economy. The smaller states, especially, depended for their existence on being able to get control of the major assets. In Mecklenburg-Strelitz, for example, the disputed land alone represented 55% of the area of the state. In other, smaller states the figure was 20% to 30% of the area. In larger states like Prussia or Bavaria, however, the percentage of disputed land was of little significance, but the absolute sizes involved were equivalent to duchies elsewhere. The demands of the royal houses totaled 2.6 billion marks. In the courts, the mostly conservative and monarchist judges repeatedly decided in favor of the royal houses. A Reichsgericht judgment of the 18th of June 1925 in particular was the cause of public resentment. It struck down a law which the USPD-dominated State Convention of Saxe-Gotha had passed on the 31st of July 1919 for the purpose of the confiscation of all the domain land of the Dukes of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. The judges held this state law to be unconstitutional. They returned all the land and forest to the former ruling house. The total value of the assets returned amounted to 37.2 million gold marks. At the time, the head of the dynastic house was Charles Edward, Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, an avowed enemy of the Republic. Prussia also negotiated for a long time with the House of Hohenzollern. The first attempt to reach agreement failed in 1920 against the resistance of the Social Democrats in the Prussian parliament. A second attempt failed in 1924 because of opposition from the House of Hohenzollern. On 12 October 1925, the Prussian Ministry of Finance submitted a new draft agreement, which was heavily criticized by the public, however, because it provided for about 3/4 of the disputed real estate to be returned to the princely house. This settlement was opposed not only by the SPD but also by the DDP, turning against its own finance minister Hermann Hoppe-Ascher. In this situation, the DPP submitted a bill to the Reichstag on 23 November 1925. This would empower the states to pass state laws regulating property disputes with the former princely houses, against which there would be no legal recourse. The SPD had few objections to this, the DDP having previously drafted a similar bill itself. Initiative for a petition for a referendum. 2 days later, on 25 November 1925, the Communist Party also initiated a bill. This did not provide for any balancing of interests between the states and the royal houses, but instead specified expropriation without compensation. The land was to be handed over to farmers and tenants. Palaces were to be converted into convalescent homes used to alleviate the housing shortage, and the cash was to go to disabled war veterans and surviving dependents of those who had fallen in the war. The bill was addressed less to the parliament, where it was unlikely to gain a majority, as to the populace. The petition for a referendum was meant to allow the people to express its will for a radical change in the ownership of property, first of all with respect to the seized property of the ruling houses. The communists realized that such a legislative initiative was attractive at a time of rising unemployment, mainly due to the sharp economic downturn since November 1925, as well as what was known as the rationalization crisis. Also, the recent hyperinflation was still in people's minds. This had shown the value of real estate, which is what was available for distribution. In line with the United Front policy, the Communist Party initiative aimed at regaining lost voters and possibly also appealing to the middle classes, who were among the losers of inflation. As part of this strategy, on the 2nd of December 1925, the Communist Party invited the SPD, the Allgemeine Deutsche Gewerkschaftsbund (ADGB), General German Trade Union Federation, the Allgemeine Freiangestelltenbund, the German Civil Service Federation, the Reichsbanner Schwarz-Rot-Gold and the Rotfrontkampfverband to join in starting a petition for a referendum. At first, the SPD reacted negatively. The Communist Party's efforts to drive a wedge between the Social Democratic masses and the SPD Fat Cat leaders was too transparent. In addition, the SPD leadership still saw the possibility of resolving the disputed issues by parliamentary means. Another reason for reservations about the initiative was the prospect of failure. More than half of all eligible voters in Germany, nearly 20 million voters, would have to vote yes in a referendum if the law had the effect of amending the constitution. However, in the preceding national election of the 7th of December 1924, the KPD and the SPD had achieved only about 10.6 million votes. In early 1926, the mood within the SPD changed. Discussions on the inclusion of Social Democrats in the national government finally broke down in January, so the SPD was then able to concentrate more on opposition politics. This was also the reason for rejecting another bill that had been drawn up by the second cabinet of Hans Luther. This bill, which was finally presented on the 2nd of February, provided for a new legal construction to handle the issue. A special court under the chairmanship of the Supreme Court President Walter Simons would have sole responsibility for the assets disputes. There was no provision for review of existing agreements between the states and the former ruling houses. Compared with the parliamentary initiative of the DDP from November 1925, this was a development that was favorable to the former ruling houses. For the SPD leadership, these factors were important but secondary. The main reason for the change of mood in the SPD leadership was something else. At the base of the SPD, there was a clear support for the legislative initiative of the Communist Party, and the party leadership feared significant loss of influence members and voters if they ignored this sentiment. On the 19th of January 1926, the chairman of the Communist Party, Ernst Thälmann, called upon the SPD to participate in what was called the Kuczynski Committee. This ad hoc committee, which was formed in mid-December 1925 from people associated with the German Peace Society and the German League for Human Rights, was named after the statistician Robert René Kuczynski and was preparing a petition for a referendum for the expropriation of the former ruling houses. About 40 different pacifist, leftist and communist groups belonged to it. Within the committee, the Communist Party and its affiliated organizations had the greatest importance. As late as the 19th of January, the SPD still rejected the Communist Party's proposal to join the Kuczynski Committee and, instead, asked the ADGB to mediate talks. These talks were intended to present to the people, in a petition for a referendum, a bill for the expropriation of the former ruling houses that had the support of as many groups as possible. The ADGB acceded to this request. The talks between the KPD, the SPD and the Committee Kuczynski, which were moderated by the ADGB, began on the 20th of January 1926. 3 days later, they agreed on a common bill. The bill provided for the expropriation of the former rulers and the families, for the public good. On the 25th of January, the bill went to the Ministry of the Interior with the request to quickly set a date for a petition for a referendum. The ministry scheduled the petition for the period for 4 to 17 March 1926. So far, the United Front tactic of the Communists was successful only in the technical sense. The SPD and KPD had drawn up an agreement on the production and distribution of petition lists and posters. A united front in the political sense was still soundly rejected by the SPD. They made a point of carrying out all agitation events alone, not jointly with the Communist Party. Local organizations of the SPD were warned against any such advances from the Communist Party and censured where any such offers had been accepted. The ADGB also made public that there was no united front with the Communists, as well as the workers' parties. The referendum campaign was publicly supported by the ADGB, the Red Front League, and a number of prominent figures, such as Albert Einstein, Kathy Kollwitz, John Hartfield and Kurt Tucholsky for the referendum. The opponents of the project, with varying degrees of commitment, were mainly to be found in the bourgeois parties, the Reichslandbund, numerous national organizations, and the churches. Result of the petition for a referendum. The petition for a referendum, carried out in the first half of March 1926, underlined the capacity of the two workers' parties to mobilize people. Of the 39.4 million eligible voters, 12.5 million entered themselves in the official lists. The minimum participation of 10% of the voters was thus exceeded by a factor of more than 3. The number of votes that the KPD and SPD had achieved in the Reichstag elections in December 1924 was exceeded by almost 18%. Particularly striking was the high level of support in the strongholds of the Centre Party. Here, the number of supporters of the petition was much higher than the total number of votes received by the KPD and SPD at the previous general election. Even domains of liberalism such as Württemberg exhibited similar trends. Particularly marked were the gains recorded in large cities. Expropriation without compensation was supported not just by supporters of the workers' parties but also by many voters in the centre and right-wing parties. In rural areas, however, there was often strong resistance to the petition. In particular in East Elbe, the KPD and SPD could not achieve the results of the last general election. Administrative obstacles to the referendum and threats by large farming employers towards employees had an effect. In Lower Bavaria in particular, there was a similar below-average participation. Bavaria had the second lowest participation, after the tiny state of Waldeck. The Bavarian People's Party and the Catholic Church vigorously and successfully advised against taking part in the petition. Also, a largely uncontroversial agreement with the House of Wittelsbach had been successfully negotiated in 1923. Preparation and outcome of the referendum. On 6 May 1926, the bill for expropriation without compensation was voted on by the Reichstag. Because of the bourgeois majority, it was passed. If the bill had been adopted without amendment, a referendum would have been avoided. On 15 March, President Hindenburg had already added another hurdle to the success of the referendum. On that day, he informed Justice Minister Wilhelm Marx that the intended expropriations did not serve the public interest but represented nothing more than fraudulent conversion of assets for political reasons. This was not permitted by the Constitution. On 24 April 1926, the Luther government expressly confirmed the President's legal opinion. For this reason, a simple majority was not sufficient for the success of the referendum, and it needed support from 50% of those eligible to vote, about 20 million voters. Because it was not expected that these numbers would be achieved, the government and the parliament began to prepare for further parliamentary discussions on the issue. These talks were also affected by the notification that any laws giving effect to the expropriation expropriation would have the intended effect of changing the constitution, meaning that they would require a two-thirds majority. Only a law that could expect the support of parts of the SPD on the left and parts of the DNVP on the right would have had a chance of succeeding. It was expected that on the 20th of June 1926 the number of those in favor of expropriation without compensation would be higher. There were a number of reasons to expect that. Because the vote in June would be decisive, greater mobilization of the voters on the left could be expected than in the March petition. The failure of all previous attempts at parliamentary compromise had lent support to those voices in the bourgeois parties that were also in favor of such a radical change. For example, youth organizations of the Centre Party and the DDP called for a yes vote. The DDP was split into supporters and opponents. The party leadership therefore left it to the DDP supporters to choose which side they would vote for. In addition, those organizations that represented the interests of the victims of inflation now recommended voting for the expropriation. Two additional factors put pressure on the opponents of the referendum, who had united on the 15th of April 1926 under the umbrella of the Working Group Against the Referendum. As with the petition, the opponents of the referendum included right-wing associations and parties, agricultural and industrial interest groups, the churches, and the Vereinigung Deutscher Hofkammern, the association representing the interests of the former federal princes. Firstly, the home of Heinrich Claas, the leader of the Pan-German League, had been searched at the behest of the Prussian Interior Ministry. This revealed comprehensive plans for a coup. Similar evidence was turned up by searchers involving his employees. Secondly, on the 7th of June 1926, excerpts of a letter which Hindenburg had written to Friedrich Wilhelm von Lobel, the president of the Reichsbürgerrat, on the 22nd of May 1926 were published. In this letter, Hindenburg called the plebiscite a grave injustice that showed a deplorable lack of sense of tradition and gross ingratitude. It was contrary to the principles of morality and justice. For the background to the correspondence, see Young 1996, p. 927 to 940. Hindenburg tolerated the use of his negative words on posters by the expropriation opponents, which laid him open to the accusation that he was not aloof from party politics but was openly supporting the conservatives. The expropriation opponents increased their efforts. The core message was the claim that the proponents of the referendum were not just interested in the expropriation of the prince's property but intended the abolition of private property as such. The opponents called for a boycott of the referendum. This made sense from the perspective because each abstention had the same effect as a no vote. The call for a boycott practically turned the secret ballot into an open one. The opponents of the referendum mobilized substantial financial resources. The DNVP, for instance, deployed significantly more money in the agitation against the referendum than in the election campaigns of 1924 and more than in the general election of 1928. The funds for the agitation against the referendum came from contributions from the dynastic families, from industrialists, and from other donations. As with the petition, especially east of the Elbe, farm workers were threatened with economic and personal sanctions if they participated in the referendum. There were attempts to scare small farmers by saying that it was not just about the expropriation of the prince's property but about livestock, farm equipment and land for all farms. Also, on the 20th of June 1926, the opponents held festivals with free beer to keep people from voting. The National Socialist German Workers' Party exacerbated the populist dimension by demanding not the expropriation of the prince's property but of Jewish immigrants who had entered Germany since the 1st of August 1914. Initially, the left wing of the NSDAP, centered on Gregor Strasser, favored the Nazis supporting the expropriation campaign. But Adolf Hitler rejected this demand at the meeting of the party leadership in Bamberg on the 14th of February 1926. Alluding to a speech by the Emperor in August 1914, he said, "For us there are now no princes, only Germans." On the 20th of June 1926, of the approximately 39.7 million voters, nearly 15.6 million cast the vote. About 14.5 million voted yes, about 0.59 million voted no. About 0.56 million votes were invalid. The referendum therefore failed because less than the required 50% of voters participated. The expropriation without compensation had again been supported in the strongholds of the Centre Party. The same was true of large urban electoral districts. The referendum had appealed to voters from the middle-class national conservative spectrum, although in some cases there were more votes cast than in the petition for a referendum. The support from the agricultural parts of the country was again below average. The participation rate was also low in Bavaria compared to other regions, despite the overall increase compared with the petition.